Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The morning light filtered through the half-drawn curtains of Sandra's bedroom, casting pale golden streaks across the white-tiled floor. The house was unusually quiet, the girls still asleep, their soft breathing drifting in from their shared room down the hall. Sandra sat on the edge of her bed, the same one she and Jackson had picked out together 14 years ago. She traced the pattern of the bedspread with her fingers, absent-mindedly. There was a time when mornings meant his voice echoing through the house, laughter, hurried kisses before work, and 2 mugs of coffee, one slightly too sweet, just the way he liked it. Now, all that remained was silence and the hum of distance. For 6 years, Jackson had lived in another city, 5 hours away, because of work. At first, they promised to visit every other weekend, but that rhythm had long died out. Their phone calls grew shorter, more functional. Updates about the children, school matters, bills, never anything about them. It wasn't sudden, it was the kind of slow unraveling you only notice when the warmth in the room begins to vanish, bit by bit. She stepped into the kitchen and moved instinctively, measuring rice, lighting the gas, boiling water for tea. The girls would be up soon, and breakfast needed to be ready. This routine, it grounded her. It gave her a sense of control, a rhythm, especially on days when the house felt too big for just the 6 of them. Every wall held a memory of Jackson. His framed certificate still hung in the hallway. His favorite chair remained untouched in the corner of the living room. The girls often played on the same rug he once rolled on with them, laughing like a boy. Despite the years apart, Sandra never removed his things. Maybe it was denial. Maybe it was hope. Or maybe it was just the kind of love that didn't know how to give up. She remembered the last time he visited. It had been brief, 3 days, 2 nights. He had seemed distracted, answering work calls constantly, barely present during dinner. The girls noticed. Even the youngest, F, had asked if Daddy still liked coming home. Sandra brushed it off at the time, saying he was just busy. But deep down, she had felt it too. His presence was more ghost than man. Later that evening, after the girls had gone to bed, Sandra sat alone in the living room with the overhead light dimmed and her thoughts loud. Her fingers moved slowly as she folded the laundry, each shirt a piece of her quiet grief. She picked up Jackson's old sweatshirt, the one he left behind 2 years ago and never came back for. It still carried a faint trace of his cologne, worn and faded. She held it close for a moment, then dropped it in the basket. She didn't cry. She rarely did anymore. Instead, she stared ahead, eyes fixed on the blank screen of the television, wondering how something that had once felt so full could now feel so hollow. The silence between them had become its own language, a space where love used to live. Still, she kept the house warm, meals ready, the girls happy. She told herself it was enough, but somewhere deep inside her, a quiet voice began to ask the question she'd never dared to before. Was this still a marriage, or just the memory of one? The sky was pale gray that Sunday morning, the kind that made the house feel smaller, quieter, as if holding its breath. Sandra sat by the window in the sitting room, peeling oranges for the girls while they giggled in the background, arguing over a cartoon on TV. Her hands moved automatically, the peel curling into neat spirals on the tray, but her mind was far away. For weeks now, she had been nursing a thought she hadn't dared say aloud. It came in quiet waves while making dinner, while picking up the girls from school, even while folding laundry at night. It was always the same question, whispered from the corner of her heart. What if we all just moved to the city? The idea felt both reckless and right. They were a family, and they were meant to be together. Jackson's absence wasn't just felt, it was etched into every moment of their daily lives. Their daughters were growing fast, and Sandra didn't want them to become strangers to their own father. She didn't want to become a stranger to him either. That evening, after putting the girls to bed, she finally reached for her phone, heart fluttering, and dialed Jackson's number. He picked up after the fourth ring, his voice distracted, a little tired. Sandra hesitated, then gently shared her thoughts. "I've been thinking maybe we should come to the city. Me and the girls. We could all be together again." There was a pause, longer than she expected. When he finally spoke, Jackson's voice was calm, but firm. "Sandra, it doesn't make sense. The house you're in is ours. I'm just renting here. It's not comfortable. The schools there are better too." She listened silently, feeling the sting of disappointment prick the back of her throat. "But the girls need their father," she said softly. He didn't argue. He just repeated that it wasn't a good idea, that it wasn't the right time, that it would be too much for everyone. Sandra didn't push. She nodded, murmured something about understanding, then ended the call. But when she put the phone down, the silence that followed was different. It wasn't empty. It was heavy. She sat for a long time in the dim room, feeling something shift inside her, like a door quietly closing. The following weeks passed in a blur of normalcy, but something inside Sandra had changed. She no longer lingered on Jackson's calls, which had grown more infrequent anyway. She stopped waiting for his texts and stopped checking the calendar to count down the days till he might visit again. It wasn't anger, it was surrender. A quiet acceptance that she was doing this alone, and had been for a long time. Still, she kept her feelings hidden, especially from the girls. They deserved joy, not the weight of adult disappointments. At night, after they had gone to bed, Sandra would sit by the balcony with a cup of tea and stare into the night sky, wondering if love could stretch across cities or if it simply faded in the distance. She didn't blame Jackson. Not really. He was chasing work, stability, doing what he thought was best. But with each passing day, she couldn't shake the feeling that the space between them had stopped being about location. It had become something else entirely. Something deeper. Something unspoken. And though she didn't say it out loud, a part of her knew the life they were supposed to live together was slowly slipping away. It was the 9th of August, a date Sandra never forgot. It was the day they married under a broad blue sky, surrounded by friends and family, with Jackson's voice trembling slightly as he vowed to love her forever. That morning, the air smelled of promise and something old, something nostalgic. Sandra woke up before dawn, the way she always did on their anniversary. She lay in bed a little longer than usual, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet hum of the fan above. The girls were still asleep, their soft snores coming in waves from the next room. Slowly, Sandra slipped out of bed and wrapped her robe around her. She already knew what she was going to cook, Jackson's favorites, a goosey soup with pounded yam, grilled plantains, and that fruit salad he always said reminded him of their first date. She moved with practiced ease in the kitchen, hands steady, even as her heart wrestled with uncertainty. He hadn't called in 2 days, but she told herself he was busy. He would come. He always came, sometimes late, sometimes tired, but he always showed up. Today would be no different. She believed that. By late afternoon, the food was ready. The girls dressed in their best clothes, and the dining table was set with care. The scent of cooking lingered sweetly in the air, mingling with the soft gospel music playing from the small speaker near the window. Sandra had even taken time to fix her hair and put on a dress she hadn't worn in a long while. It cinched slightly at the waist, reminding her that she had aged since the last time Jackson saw her. But she didn't mind. She wanted to feel beautiful for him, for herself, for the memories they built in this home. As the hours ticked by, the sun dipped lower in the sky, and the shadows in the living room stretched longer. The girls began to fidget. F, the youngest, dozed off in her chair. Sandra checked her phone again. No messages. No missed calls. She dialed Jackson's number. Once, twice, 3 times. No answer. The food grew cold. The music stopped. She stood up eventually, slowly clearing the table as the weight in her chest grew heavier. She didn't speak. The girls knew better than to ask. They had felt it too, the quiet heartbreak that hung in the air like thick smoke. By midnight, she sat alone at the table, still dressed up, her phone resting silently beside her untouched plate. The next morning, Sandra woke with a pounding headache and swollen eyes. She had cried in silence the night before, long after the girls had gone to sleep. It wasn't just that Jackson hadn't come. It was the way he didn't even call. Not a word. Not a message. Not even a lie. Just silence, heavy and deliberate. She moved about the house mechanically, packing away the leftover food, folding the napkins she had carefully laid out the day before. She didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to explain anything to the girls, but they had seen enough. They were growing, noticing, understanding things she hoped they wouldn't have to just yet. Later that day, she took a walk around the compound alone, her feet dragging slightly, her heart sore with the weight of unspoken truths. She tried to remember the last time she and Jackson had laughed together, the last time he held her like she mattered, but the memories felt blurry now, like pages of a book left out in the rain. That evening, as the sky turned orange and purple above her, Sandra whispered into the wind without realizing she had spoken, "I think he's slipping away," and somehow, saying it made it feel more real than ever before. The house was unusually still when Sandra received the call, so quiet that the faint buzz of the refrigerator in the kitchen felt too loud. It was mid-morning, and she had just finished sweeping the corridor when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Those calls were often marketers or automated voices selling things she didn't need. But something, an instinct perhaps, urged her to pick up. "Hello," she said, the broom still in her hand, her voice calm but guarded. There was a moment of silence on the other end before a man's voice came through, polite but urgent. "Please, is this Mrs. Sandra Jackson?" She straightened. "Yes?" The voice softened. "I'm calling from County General Hospital in Portside. Your husband, Mr. Jackson, was brought in last night. He was attacked. He's in critical condition." Sandra didn't respond at first. She felt her heart drop, but her mouth couldn't form words. "Please," the voice continued, "we need you to come as soon as you can." The line went dead a few seconds later. She stood there, staring at the phone in her hand, the sound of her own breathing loud in her ears. Without realizing it, she dropped the broom and sank into the nearest chair, her mind racing, a cold chill crawling down her back. The journey to Portside felt like it existed outside time. Sandra traveled alone, having told her neighbor to watch the children without giving too many details. She didn't want to scare them. She didn't even know what to say. The bus ride was long and hot, and though her hands clutched her bag tightly in her lap, her thoughts were everywhere, flashing images of Jackson's face, memories of arguments, laughter, silence. She kept wondering what attack meant. A robbery? A fight? A mistake? No one had said much, and her imagination filled in the gaps with things too terrible to voice. By the time she reached the hospital, her body felt heavy with dread. She followed a nurse through a long, sterile corridor, her footsteps echoing off the tiled floor. And then there he was, lying on a hospital bed, tubes in his nose, his face swollen and bruised beyond recognition. His chest rose and fell slowly, each breath seeming like a struggle. She felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. She hadn't seen him in almost 3 months, but even through the damage, she recognized him. Her husband, the father of her children. Sandra didn't cry. She just stood there, frozen, as the doctor explained his injuries: fractured ribs, internal bleeding, head trauma. The words blurred, but one phrase cut through: "We're doing all we can, but it's serious." Sandra was still standing at the foot of the bed when a woman entered the room. She was young, maybe in her early 30s, dressed in jeans and a shirt that clung too tightly to her frame. Her eyes, rimmed with red, looked startled when she saw Sandra. But instead of leaving, she stepped closer, a child clinging to her hand. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice strained but defiant. "I didn't know they had called you too." Sandra blinked at her, confused. The woman looked down at the child, a boy, maybe 4 or 5, and then back at Sandra. "This is my son," she said. "Jackson's son." It was like something shattered inside Sandra, slow and brutal. Her eyes shifted from the woman to the boy, who stared curiously at the man in the hospital bed. And in that single moment, everything, years of holding on, waiting, trusting, began to come undone. The woman began to explain, hurriedly, nervously, something about a fight, an argument, another man, and how Jackson had slapped her, how she'd called someone she shouldn't have, how it got out of hand. But Sandra couldn't hear anymore. She looked back at her husband's broken body, and for the first time in all their years of marriage, she wasn't sure who she was looking at. The hospital corridors were dim that evening, the fluorescent lights casting a dull glow that made everything feel colder. Sandra sat alone outside the ward, her back stiff against the metal chair, her fingers interlocked in her lap. The room behind her held the man she once thought she knew completely, her husband, the father of her children, the man who had promised her forever. But now, after the encounter with the woman and the child, nothing felt familiar anymore. Her body was still in shock, her thoughts circling in silent chaos. She hadn't spoken much since the confrontation, hadn't asked for details, hadn't demanded answers. Her silence was not forgiveness, it was disbelief. Her eyes remained fixed on the white-tiled floor as nurses passed, voices low, feet quick, as if everyone around her knew something was crumbling. She could still hear that woman's voice, repeating words she never expected to hear. "He's the father of my son." But it wasn't the words that had haunted her the most. It was the way the boy had stood there, so comfortable, so accustomed to Jackson. That casual familiarity had pierced her deeper than any confession. 2 days passed, and Sandra remained in Portside. She found a cheap motel not far from the hospital and spent her days sitting beside Jackson's bed, watching the machines that beeped and flickered and breathed for him. She hadn't called the girls yet. What could she possibly say? That their father was fighting for his life, that he had another family, that the truth she had shielded them from all these years had finally exploded in her face. She wasn't ready. Each morning, the same woman came to the hospital, sometimes with the boy, sometimes alone. She didn't speak to Sandra again, just nodded slightly in passing, her face a mixture of guilt and defiance. Once, Sandra caught her wiping tears in the hallway, but she looked away. She didn't want to know her sorrow. She didn't care if it was real. On the 3rd evening, the woman approached her unexpectedly. "He was with me for 5 years, she said softly, almost apologetically. "I didn't know he hadn't divorced you. He said you were separated, that you moved on." Sandra said nothing. Her jaw tightened, her eyes cold and unblinking. 5 years. The timeline clashed violently with her memories, anniversaries, video calls, his occasional visits, all happening while he had been building another life behind her back. Later that night, Jackson briefly opened his eyes. It was past midnight, and the room was quiet except for the soft hum of machines. His gaze was weak, unfocused at first, but when it settled on Sandra, something flickered. Shame, recognition, fear. He tried to speak, but the oxygen tube made it hard. She leaned closer, and his hand, weak and trembling, reached for hers. "Sandra." "I'm sorry," he rasped. The words were hoarse, broken. Tears pooled in his eyes as he whispered, "Please forgive me." She looked at him for a long moment, not moving, not blinking. So many things wanted to come out: anger, heartbreak, questions, accusations. But none of them found their way to her lips. Instead, she simply sat there, letting the silence say everything she couldn't. Forgiveness wasn't a word she could hand over like loose change, not after all he had stolen from her. She didn't know what she felt, only that something had cracked open inside her, and she wasn't sure if it would ever close again. She stayed there by his side for the rest of the night, listening to the slow rhythm of his breathing, wondering who this man really was, and who she had become in the shadow of his lies. The rain started gently the next morning, brushing against the hospital windows like a soft warning. Sandra sat beside Jackson, watching the slow, shallow rise and fall of his chest. The bruises on his face had faded into a deep, uneven hue, but his body was still failing, silent alarms ringing in the way his skin paled, the way the monitors beeped with sluggish rhythm. A doctor had come in earlier, eyes cautious, voice carefully measured, and spoken to her in words too polite to mask the truth. "There's internal damage we can't fix. He's not responding well. You should prepare yourself." But Sandra had already prepared days ago, the moment she first laid eyes on his broken form. Her heart had begun the grieving long before the machines hinted at it. She watched him now with a strange detachment, not because she no longer cared, but because something inside her had shifted. She was holding the hand of a man she had once loved completely, who had once laughed beside her in the glow of candlelit dinners, who had touched her with tenderness and whispered dreams into her ears. But that man had become a stranger before he became a patient, and now he was drifting into something beyond either of them. In a quiet moment, Jackson stirred again, his eyes fluttering open just enough to find her. His lips parted, dry and cracked, and she leaned in as he whispered her name. "Sandra." It came out like a breath, thin and faint. She didn't speak, just nodded. He blinked slowly, struggling to hold on to consciousness, and with what little strength he had, he murmured, "I made a mess. I didn't know how to fix it." His eyes welled with tears, and his face twisted in pain, not just physical, but something deeper, like a soul unraveling. She watched him, her own eyes heavy, and reached up to wipe his tears with the edge of her scarf. There was nothing she could say to ease the weight of his regret, nothing that would change the years of deception, the betrayal, the aching silence she had endured. But still, a small part of her, the part that had once loved him, that still remembered the way he looked at their first daughter in the delivery room, felt the pain of watching him fade. She held his hand as his breathing slowed, as the machines began to emit irregular beeps, and nurses moved quietly, efficiently. And then, in the early hours of the morning, Jackson exhaled one final time, and the room fell silent. Sandra didn't cry, not right away. She sat still, her hand still wrapped in his, her eyes dry and fixed on the ceiling. Everything felt surreal, like a scene from a dream where nothing made sense but everything still hurt. The door opened behind her and closed again, and footsteps approached, quiet, hesitant. It was the woman. She stood at the foot of the bed with the boy in her arms, eyes red and swollen. When she realized what had happened, she broke into a sob, clutching the child tighter. But Sandra didn't look at her. She stood slowly, gently placing Jackson's hand by his side, then reached for her bag. Without a word, she walked past them, out of the room, out of the corridor, out into the rain. The water soaked through her scarf, her dress, her skin, but she welcomed it. It felt like cleansing, like something heavy was being washed away. She didn't look back. There was nothing left for her there, not in that hospital, not in the memory of what could have been. As she walked down the road, alone and soaked to the bone, Sandra realized she wasn't leaving grief behind. She was carrying it, but this time she was choosing how it would shape her. The sun returned 2 days after Jackson's death, but its warmth didn't reach Sandra. She stood at the edge of the compound, where their home was tucked behind rows of overgrown hibiscus shrubs. The house looked the same, quiet, unmoved, untouched by the storm that had ripped through her life. The girls ran out when they saw her, their feet pattering against the floor tiles as they called out "Mummy," and clung to her waist. Their small arms around her brought a surge of something deep, grief, relief, guilt. She knelt, hugging them tightly, breathing them in like oxygen after drowning. Her neighbor had cared for them well. They looked fed, dressed, unaware of the weight she carried back with her. Inside, the house smelled of familiarity, of her cooking, their childhood, of years spent patching a family together with faith and effort. Everything seemed untouched, but to Sandra the space had changed forever. She was home, but nothing felt steady. She moved through the room slowly that night, touching the walls, rearranging pillows, fixing curtains that didn't need fixing, like she was searching for pieces of herself in the silence. The next morning brought disruption. A knock came at the door just after breakfast, and when Sandra opened it, two men stood outside, one in a stiff gray suit with a briefcase, the other in a brown polo with an air of casual authority. The man in the suit introduced himself as the family lawyer. He carried papers, documents, his words clipped and rehearsed. Sandra invited them in, confused but composed. The girls played quietly in the background, sensing something was wrong. She listened as the lawyer explained that Jackson had drafted a will recently and that it had been processed legally. Sandra sat upright, a tight knot forming in her stomach. Her name was not in the will. Not once. The house, the very home she had raised her children in, had been willed to a boy she had met only days ago. The lawyer placed the documents in her hands with sympathy in his eyes, but the gesture felt hollow. The betrayal reopened like a fresh wound. "This is a mistake," she whispered. But it wasn't. Everything had been signed and sealed. Sandra sat frozen as the man in the polo began explaining the legal transition of ownership. There was no room for questions, no room for fairness, just cold facts. By the time they left, Sandra had only one truth left to hold. She and her daughters had no legal claim to the life they'd built. Word traveled fast. Within a week, Jackson's mistress returned, this time not in grief, but with confidence. She came with a printed notice and a new man by her side, and Sandra watched from the steps of the front porch as strangers walked through her home, appraising it, murmuring about price and paint. Her daughters sat silently behind her, unsure of what it all meant. Sandra didn't scream. She didn't fight. Her voice had been stripped too many times, her energy drained by betrayal after betrayal. But when she closed the door behind her that night, something inside her hardened. She packed slowly, not because she didn't want to leave, but because leaving meant accepting that Jackson had chosen to erase her. That everything she had sacrificed, hoped for, endured, had been made invisible by a signature and a stamp. When her siblings came the next day to move her out, they didn't ask too many questions. They held her gently, brought bags and boxes, and helped her and the girls start again. As they drove away from the house, Sandra didn't look back. She didn't need to. The life she had lived there had ended long before the lock on the front door changed. The new house was smaller, a modest two-bedroom bungalow tucked behind an aging row of shops on a quieter side of town. It didn't carry the elegance of their old home. The floors were tiled in faded patterns, the walls carried chips of old paint, and the single ceiling fan in the sitting room creaked with every slow turn. But to Sandra, it was a shelter, and more importantly, it was hers. Her elder brother had helped secure it, 6-month rent paid up front, no questions asked. The rest of her siblings contributed in quiet, selfless ways, one bringing mattresses, another showing up with pots and gas burners, even an aunt from the village sending dried stockfish and gari. The kindness staggered her. For the first time in years, she wasn't carrying the burden alone. She unpacked slowly over the next few days, one drawer at a time, sorting through their belongings like she was learning her life all over again. The girls adjusted faster than she expected. They giggled on the bare floor, made games of stacking boxes, and argued about who would sleep closest to her. Their innocence pulled her forward, inch by inch, from the edge of despair. One morning, a week after they moved in, her sister, Amaka, brought her to a small shop space just 2 streets away. "We registered it in your name," she said, pressing a set of keys into Sandra's hand. It was a tiny space, enough for a single table, a shelf, and a chair, but when Sandra stepped inside, she felt something shift. Her sister had stocked it lightly: bags of rice, vegetable oil, spices, soaps, essentials. A small generator hummed at the back. Amaka squeezed her hand and whispered, "You need something that's yours now. Start small. Grow it. We'll help you." That evening, after tucking the girls into bed, Sandra stood in front of the mirror and looked at herself closely. Not the version Jackson used to see, not the woman who waited and stayed and endured, but the one who survived it all and was still standing. Her reflection looked tired, yes, but it also looked steady. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, something unfamiliar but welcome. She wasn't healed. Not yet. But there was a pulse again, something fragile but real. The days began to fall into rhythm. She woke early, swept the front of the shop, arranged her goods, smiled at customers. Business was slow but steady. Some days were harder than others. There were mornings she woke up angry for no reason, moments when grief came rushing in like a flood, the sound of Jackson's voice in her memory, the echo of their children's laughter in that old home. Sometimes she'd stare at the corner of the shop and wonder how she got here. But then one of her girls would come running with a schoolbook or a silly joke, and the darkness would retreat. She no longer counted her life in what was lost. She started counting it in what remained: her daughters, her breath, her resilience. Every coin she earned at the shop felt like a step forward. Every customer who returned felt like a small victory. The past still lived in her, but now it walked behind her, not beside. Sandra didn't know what the future would look like, but she knew one thing. She was building something new, something her own, brick by slow brick. And this time, no one could take it away. The letter came folded neatly in a cream envelope with no return address. It was delivered by a courier, handed to Sandra while she was sweeping outside the shop just as the sun began to rise. The man didn't say much, only asked her name, handed it over, and left before she could ask who sent it. She turned it over in her hands for several minutes, her stomach tightening. Something about the envelope felt personal, heavy in a way that wasn't about weight, but meaning. She opened it slowly, carefully peeling the paper apart like it might tear at her if she moved too fast. Inside was a printed document and a single handwritten note clipped to it. The note read, "I thought you should know the truth. I'm sorry it took this long. Dr. Yusuf." Sandra's eyes dropped to the document, heart thudding in her chest. It was a DNA test. She read the names again and again: Jackson Chukwuma, alleged father; Michael Okari, child. Result, 0% probability of paternity. She stood there for what felt like a full minute, eyes fixed on the black and white lines that upended everything yet again. The boy Jackson claimed as his, the one his mistress had presented boldly, wasn't his after all. The betrayal had layers, now one more peeled away, raw and absurd. The letter stole the air from her lungs, but not in the way pain used to. This time it felt different, like confirmation, like proof that her instincts hadn't lied. Sandra sat behind the shop counter that afternoon with the document open on her lap, staring at it not for clarity, but to remind herself it was real. Dr. Yusuf, the hospital senior consultant, must have sent it after the dust settled. Maybe he felt responsible, or maybe he wanted to clear Jackson's name posthumously. Either way, it brought more than the truth. It brought a wave of conflicting emotions: anger, resentment, relief, and something bitter that tasted like vindication. She remembered the woman's eyes at the hospital, the quiet smugness she wore during the house claim, the calm assurance that her son was all the proof she needed. Sandra clenched her jaw. So many lives disrupted by lies. So much grief handed out like a punishment she didn't deserve. And still, here she was, on her feet, breathing, surviving, not untouched but not destroyed. She wondered if the woman knew yet, if she'd been told, if the truth had begun to burn through her own illusion of victory. That evening, after closing the shop and walking her daughters home, Sandra made a quiet decision. She folded the DNA result back into the envelope and placed it in the bottom drawer of her bedside table, beneath old photographs and unused notebooks. She didn't tell her girls. Not yet. Maybe not ever. What would they gain from the truth now, except deeper confusion about the father they already lost in too many ways? Instead, Sandra poured her focus into the routine of her new life. She started adding new items to her shop: eggs, sachet milk, powdered seasoning. The customers kept returning, some staying to talk a while, share gossip, or ask for advice. Slowly, the pain began to stitch itself into something else, a quiet resilience, a deeper stillness. That night, as her daughter slept beside her, Sandra lay awake staring at the ceiling, her chest rising slowly with each breath. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like the victim of a story. She felt like the author, still writing, still shaping, still choosing what comes next. It was a warm Saturday morning when Sandra found herself at the local Women's Business Forum, a small gathering held under a makeshift canopy behind the town hall. She hadn't planned to attend, but one of her regular customers had insisted, saying it would do her good. She sat near the back at first, observing quietly as women of different ages shared stories about running shops, raising children alone, navigating debts, and still waking up the next day to start again. There was laughter, occasional tears, and applause that came not from pity but from recognition. When one woman stood up and spoke about how she started her small poultry business after her husband vanished with their savings, Sandra felt something stir inside her. These women weren't just surviving, they were transforming pain into purpose, failure into fuel. The moderator called for someone new to speak. For a moment, Sandra hesitated. But then she stood, her voice steady as she introduced herself. She didn't tell them everything, but what she shared was enough. A story of a house lost, a marriage broken, and the quiet courage of beginning again with 5 daughters and a shop the size of a pantry. Later that afternoon, as she walked home with a small notebook of ideas clutched to her chest, Sandra felt the shift in her bones. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was the kind of shift that happens when pain stops being the loudest voice in your head. She passed by a new paint store and paused. The sign outside was crooked and the walls looked plain, but something about it made her smile. Maybe she'd repaint her shop soon. Maybe she'd rename it. Something bold. Something hers. As she walked on, she noticed her daughters playing hopscotch outside their gate, their laughter rising like music. She paused to watch them, her heart swelling, not with sadness, but pride. They were growing. Strong, bright, resilient. Just like her. She remembered the version of herself who used to wait by the window for her husband's call. The woman who cooked meals and celebrated anniversaries alone. That woman had mourned deeply, but she had also paved the road for who Sandra had become now, a provider, a protector, a woman who had been bruised but not buried. That night, the house was filled with the smell of pepper soup and fresh bread, comfort food for a new chapter. Sandra sat with her daughters at the table, listening to them talk about school, friends, and silly jokes they had made up. She laughed with them, genuinely, her eyes soft but alive. When the girls went to bed, she sat at the window alone, the night breeze kissing her face. The street was quiet, but inside, her mind was full. She picked up her journal and wrote one sentence at the top of a fresh page. This is not where my story ends. Then, without fanfare, she wrote another. I forgive him. She didn't write it for Jackson. She wrote it for herself, for the freedom of no longer carrying a grief that no longer served her. She closed the journal, turned off the lamp, and climbed into bed, her heart not entirely healed, but whole in a way it had never been before. Sandra was no longer waiting to be chosen. She had chosen herself, and that made all the difference. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.